Hello and welcome to Harlem Stories. This is Adam Feinberg, and we are broadcasting today. It is the middle of October, but this might not be playing for a little while. But I just wanted to welcome you to the podcast. It is a bi-weekly podcast, and we discuss Upper Manhattan, and we discuss not only the neighborhoods, the architecture, the people, the stories of these neighborhoods, but because I am a real estate agent and I focus my business here, we also talk about some broker related stories in terms of buying and selling. Today, we're going to discuss how can I afford more space for less money? And there's a lot of different options out there, and a lot of people aren't really sure exactly how do we go about this in our search. And today, we're going to discuss that. There are always ways to find more space for your money, though much depends on what will work for you. And obviously, not everything I'm going to suggest is going to work for every buyer, or potentially, none of these could work for you. And you might ultimately determine that, yeah, because of my requirements, because of my needs, maybe I am going to have to pony up for, more premium space. But today we're going to give you some options to consider, in your search and basically how to find more space for your money. So first point that we're going to discuss, and it's an obvious one, and I usually start a lot of my buyer conversations off with this, is the difference in pricing between condos versus co-ops. Condos tend to be 15 to 30% more expensive than comparable co-ops. Co-ops as a group tend to be far more restrictive than condos, and they represent about 70% of the total inventory in Manhattan. So some buyers will find that they don't really have much of a choice because of either their personal circumstances, price, or even the type of home desired. There aren't many new co-ops that have been constructed in the last couple of decades outside of some income-restricted buildings. And some of those buildings have since lost those income restrictions, but not all. But if a buyer is looking to buy in a modern building, they might not have the option of buying in a co-op, and that's the reason why I mentioned that. So co-ops are just far greater in number, and obviously they're more restrictive. So the combination of those two factors are going to make co-ops far cheaper than condos. Condos are going to give you a lot more flexibility though, in terms of purchasing and qualifying to purchase, but also in terms of, a living style. Not every co-op is going to permit like pied-à-terres, or they're not going to permit subletting so readily and easily. So these are, some points to take into consideration in the condo versus co-op world. But if you're looking for more space, you can get certainly more space for your money if you're looking for a co-op. So another possibility in the co-op world, and this is kind of like that subcategory that I mentioned earlier, the income-restricted co-op. Now, these buildings, they have their own challenges associated with them, and in rare instances, there have been some newer buildings that had some income-restricted units available for purchase, and sometimes they're even still now coming out as buildings, get entirely redeveloped or built from scratch. Now, these are often going to be, especially when they're new buildings or newly rehabbed the entire building. They're often available via housing lottery. I've seen some condos that have income-restricted apartments, and typically these have high flip taxes if sold within the first 15 years for the first owner. But once these are resold, the income restrictions don't apply for that first resale buyer and beyond. An example of this would be 68 Bradhurst Avenue, where about half the apartments were sold as income-restricted. And while the original owners would have been income restricted and they would have to repay certain other subsidized costs, the first buyers as a resale wouldn't be income restricted, but the deed, at least in that case, has sublet restrictions until the tax abatement winds up expiring. So it could be either a 15-year or a 25-year tax abatement, and there could be sublet restrictions, even though the income restriction might have disappeared. So now, it's entirely possible the building doesn't enforce any of these sublet restrictions in these circumstances. I've seen it, but it's up to the building to enforce. And we do have, just as a reference point, there is a Harlem Stories episode that specifically addresses HDFC income restricted co-ops. So, that's a second way of, finding more space for less money. Number three, select a cheaper neighborhood or a cheaper section of the neighborhood. Sometimes even a few blocks can make a huge difference. A good example, I've worked with a buyer looking for an apartment that only had a couple possible matches in the last year within their search radius, but it was too late to extend an offer. In this case, there are some good match possibilities that are a few blocks outside of the search radius, but still within the same neighborhood that are not only a great match, but also a bit cheaper. So this buyer basically said, well, all of my friends are, and family are located, within these blocks. I don't want to be too far from them. So I'm going to cut my search radius over up to this block. And ultimately, where the deals can be found, where the buyer can actually, find some inventory at great prices and, get a lot more space for the money, it was actually just like 2 or 3 blocks north of where they, basically said, I don't want to go further than this. But you know what? That's, every buyer has their requirements, their needs, their wants. So, that is absolutely fine when you're looking for that, but obviously you have to acknowledge that, yeah, I might be passing up some opportunities that are a great fit for me just simply because I'm like, I have these other requirements. So yeah, sometimes a few blocks really can make a difference. So here's another tip over here. That I tend to say over and over again. And, very often this can be said of the stock market too. And I can say this having 16 years of capital markets experience. Buy when others are scared and be a contrarian. Ultimately what winds up happening, and I could say this has certainly been the case in this market that we're in today, is basically a lot of people have been afraid to buy and they're sitting on the sidelines waiting for, interest rates to drop. And, one of the things that I'm noticing is that like what'll happen is that once interest rates are likely to drop considerably, what'll happen is prices will probably go up, and then you're stuck with a higher price at that point. But the smarter strategy would be ultimately, unless you don't think that New York City is ever going to come back, or you're not sure on your timeline and it's likely to be short, and you're probably concerned, am I going to recoup my money? But generally we don't recommend buying unless you're going to be holding for, pretty much at least 5 to 7 years, preferably longer. But we know in New York City, a lot of our owners tend to sell within 4 to 7 years. So, one of the things in terms of making sure that like you're meeting your needs, but at the same time, when the market's weak and interest rates are high, you can always refinance at a later date, but at the same time, you're going to get a much lower price when the market is weak. So you can always refinance, but that purchase price you're locked into. So, that is certainly something to keep in mind. By the time this episode airs, it might still be in time, the cheapest time and most likely the bottom of the market, for 2024, 2025 has likely passed us. But at the same point, it's Upper Manhattan, is not going to recover as quickly, as the rest. It's more of like this rubber band effect. And if you think about that, like when you stretch out that rubber band, and that's when prices go up and, people expand their search radius. When prices go down, they reduce their search radius. So, that is certainly one component of what's impacting us here. But when the market is weak and falling, there's often a lack of clarity in where the market's headed. And so many of our buyers are too afraid to overpay to move forward. And, I tend to say, look at it this way. Did you buy at the very, very bottom? Maybe, maybe not. And that's what a lot of people are afraid of. But the reality is I spent, many, many years in finance, and risk is always, on the table no matter what you do. And having been on many trading desks, I tend to say is like there's virtually no one out there. There's only a handful of people out there that have ever been able to time the market successfully. And I'm not just talking luck or potentially even skill, but I've been able to repeat it. So if you're a first time home buyer and you're scared of this, or even a second time home buyer, and you don't do this very often, really the best time is to take advantage of that generalized fear in the market. And that risk, sure, it's a possibility. I don't want to be dismissive of real possibility of risk, but in most cases, especially if the situation has dragged on for a while, the odds are high that you'll be buying into or at least close to the bottom of the market. And no one has a crystal ball or can time the market precisely and repeatedly. But historically, it's been the contrarians that wind up making the best deals. So when the market is rising and the most deals get done, and even though every buyer tells us they want the best deal, they typically missed when that was for fear. And there's an old saying: when there's blood in the streets, buy real estate, and that seems to always continually wind up holding true. So let's go on to the next point over here of trying to get more space for the money. When there's renovations needed and discounts can be found for your trouble. So it's expensive, it's time consuming, and often stressful to renovate, which is why most apartments that require renovations tend to sit on the market longer. That said, if the apartment is priced at a substantial discount to account for the points above, buyers can often get quite a discount and create the apartment that they want, not what they're buying into, and certainly they get that opportunity. Next point, distressed or for sale, death, divorce, disaster, etc. I've heard, 4Ds, I've heard the 5Ds, whatever it may be, but, ultimately these are the scenarios that we come to. Foreclosures, they're rare in Manhattan, so please don't count on this as your savior to find a deal. They do exist, but in most cases, it's important to understand that in many cases, that the foreclosures rarely happen quickly, and it's not uncommon in Manhattan for the foreclosure process to take many years to complete. Divorce sales happen, and these can be challenging purchases depending on how well the couple can work together to resolve the sale, and estate sales can be drawn out as well, so patience is needed. Now, going back to the foreclosure component, I have personal experience with it. Unfortunately, I've served as a condo board president, and I say unfortunately, it's a lot of work for zero compensation. But even further unfortunate that I had to foreclose on an owner for failure to pay common charges and special assessments. And, I know a lot of people like, well, why didn't you try to work it out? We did try to work it out, but ultimately this dragged on in, between the board, actions and what was going on the legal front and the advice that we were given combined with the courts themselves. It dragged on for almost 13 years from default until we got new neighbors in. So it's not always a very quick process and something that you need to be aware of depending on the situation. Now, if it's an estate sale and they already have, all the estate issues already clarified and it's truly ready for sale, odds are it will be a much quicker process. And, if there's any delays at all regarding that, it'll be minor. So on to the next point. So notice there's a lot of different ways to potentially, stretch your money out. But our next point, buying a walk-up building. Typically, these apartments, they have cheaper purchase prices, but not only on the purchase price, but also cheaper monthlies, as many tend to be smaller buildings with little to no amenities. And you wouldn't believe if you started looking into the level of detail here on just how expensive it is to operate an elevator, because it's not just the ongoing maintenance costs, the additional electric, but there's also routine testing requirements as well. There's I remember a 2-year and a 5-year inspection cycle that are required, and these things can be very expensive, and if anything goes wrong, then you may have to go through that recertification process. So walk-up buildings are going to be tend to be cheaper, for that reason and many others, but these are interesting opportunities depending on your interest or ability to do it. But further subsets in this are high floors in the walk-up building. So like the 4th floor and up, it's possible that like those units can sit on the market for 2 or more years before they even find a buyer. And and this is not unusual. And keep in mind that if you do go down this path, that it's entirely possible it could take a year or two to find a buyer, for your side. So now you're an owner kind of stuck in this for a while. So, if you are considering those walk-ups, just understand that that discount is substantial for a reason. Now, the exception is when the apartment is priced to attract buyers that'll seriously consider a walk-up of so many stairs if the apartment has something special. So, for example, skylights or a private roof deck or something of that nature. Um, in that walk up, also there's the first floor too, and a lot of times that applies to whether it's an elevator building or a walk up. But yeah, that first floor, it comes to that, and we'll get back to that in a moment. But next point that I want you to consider apartments, and I don't come across too many buyers like this, but if it makes a difference for you, great. Consider apartments with poor natural light. Unfortunately, these are quite common at many of the lower price points for whatever a buyer is looking for. As most of our buyers, they want natural sunlight. Hint: if you're searching online, looking at properties, and you see something that seems too good to be true, odds are it's a walk-up, or it has poor natural light, or high monthlies, or some combination of these types of issues. There could be other scenarios of, why that's the case too, but these are kind of like your key indicators. Earlier, a moment ago, I mentioned about the first floor and cellar apartments. Now, I personally own a first floor cellar duplex, or if you're getting just the first floor. Now, I bought from the sponsor itself of new construction, and I later found out from a broker who bought the apartment in the building that she had a few different buyers ready to move forward to buy my apartment had I not signed the contract. Now, that's a less common scenario in these first floor seller opportunities, but apparently a lot of people thought my apartment was as attractive as I did, so I got to it first. But this is well before I became an agent myself, and I bought a first floor cellar duplex, and ultimately that worked out the way it ended up working out. I got 35% more space than the apartments above me, which were all the same size except for my apartment. And I got it ultimately for the same price as the fifth floor apartment. So if you need more space, I got 35% more space for the same price as the fifth floor. This could be an option. Mind you, there's lots of possible downsides to buying in the ground floor and basement cellar apartment, but that's potentially a topic for an entirely separate episode, but it still may be a great way to stretch that dollar. So on to the next point, working with the right broker that can identify underpriced apartments. So the more I know about my buyers' wants and needs as a broker, as well as their lifestyle, the more I can help them find the right space for them. Don't withhold information, because ultimately it will help me. Any information I get will wind up helping me help you. And that's not a cliche, although it is, but it is true that, the more information I have on your situation, the better I can identify and say, I think this is, I don't know if they necessarily were considering something like this, but I think based on everything I've been hearing that, maybe we should. I'm going to propose this apartment to this buyer. And this is a conversation that I really have either with myself or, ultimately with my buyers. And, and sometimes that really works out. And, the buyers are surprised that they weren't even considering something like this. And all of a sudden, boom, we found them a great match. And it wasn't something that they were considering before. So I've helped buyers find that dream apartment off market in some cases, underpriced by six-figure amount because the listing broker didn't normally work anywhere near the neighborhood, or perhaps because I was targeting this building for the buyer, but nothing had hit the market since prior to the buyer started searching, or even just because I understood what would wow that buyer, even though the apartment was not at all what they were otherwise including in their search. So, that is certainly, yet another possibility. And we continue. There's still more points to come. And it's kind of like almost like, but wait, there's more. And in this case, there's quite a bit more, to discuss here. So Another consideration, and I know a lot of people are reluctant to even consider this, but there are sometimes valid reasons to consider this. A building that has high monthly charges but lower purchase price to kind of help offset that monthly expense. So sometimes a buyer might have the monthly income, but they don't have enough saved up for what is often a far more expensive apartment. So in these cases, if and we might see this, like doctors, that are just first starting out, they want, first off, they might be able to qualify for doctor's loans if it's like a condo, but they might, find something like some of these land lease buildings that I've seen in the city where the price is dirt cheap, but the monthlies could be sky high, and, they can afford the monthlies, but they just don't have the kind of money that it takes for the down payment, for a much pricier home. So, sometimes these can be adjusted. So if the monthly carrying costs are high in the building compared to other similar buildings, the price is often adjusted lower. And we see this often with the land lease buildings. They have these high monthly charges. But it's worth mentioning in these land lease buildings, in a lot of them, it could just be more complicated due to the nature of the land lease. And for those that are not familiar with these buildings, these are often co-ops or condoms, and are sometimes even condos where the building is constructed like a co-op, but the land is owned by another owner. So much of Battery Park City are land lease buildings where the Port Authority owns the underlying land. The building typically has higher monthly common charges or monthly charges to the owners because in addition to all the usual expenses, they typically also have to pay rent to the landowner. And I only know of one land lease building north of 96th Street, so this is more common far more common in other neighborhoods, but in Upper Manhattan, there's only that one building. And honestly, that is a newer construction, with a 99-year lease, and I think they're like 12, 13 years into, the total of the lease, so they have quite a bit of room to go there. So yet another component over here of looking at more space for the money, low monthly charges. Now, buildings that receive significant income from sources other than the monthly charges to building owners. So perhaps the building receives income from cell phone antennas on the top of their building. Maybe they get it from stores or parking garages or buildings with rentals in them where they sublet some of the units. So buildings with low common charges is something that I like to make my clients aware of. I know most of my buyers actually ask me for a building with low monthly charges, and I give them some examples of why they might not want to. And I know I go into this in multiple other episodes as well, but if I urge caution if the building doesn't have a lot of cash on hand or other revenue sources, since it's possible maintenance could be deferred in some of these buildings with the low monthly common charges or monthly charges. It might still be a good option for some buyers. And don't get me wrong. I don't want to dissuade you. I just want you to understand what risk is potentially out there. So even if the building isn't sufficiently funding its needs, but it still might be worth mentioning the risks. And so a buyer understands, and they might say, you know what? I can afford to put away an extra $300 or $400 a month in savings to offset the lower common charges and, just kind of force that savings, because we know in a lot of these buildings that have, low monthlies that are not necessarily justified by like some other revenue stream, a lot of times they're doing it because, what they might be doing is holding special assessments. But if I had a client with a limited budget and the monthlies were low because the building collects both a flip tax and sales, or as well as other multiple revenue sources from like the parking garage or other retail spaces, I've had this situation, and it allowed the client to afford a higher purchase price because what we're looking at the total cost of monthly ownership rather than just the purchase price. So these are among the things that I've like my buyers to consider. I'm like, it's not just the purchase price. It's going to be purchase price plus your monthlies. So really important to take into consideration. So tax abated apartments is yet another point that we want to bring into this equation. So, I don't even know how many points I found to discuss with you guys and talk about, all the real possibilities over here. So my personal property taxes, they're less than $4 a month. Starbucks costs more than that. Take that. Tax abatement apartments could allow a buyer to stretch their budget, especially if they expect their income to rise significantly in the future. Now, at some point, the tax abatement starts to roll off or end entirely. So it's not something that you can count on forever, but you can ask your broker and say, what would the taxes be on this apartment if there was no tax abatement today? Now, a lot of times people say, what would the taxes be if at the end? And we don't know the answer to that because we don't have a crystal ball, because the question implies that we know what tax policy will be in the future. So instead, what I recommend buyers asking, or I'll actually address it on their behalf anyway, but what would the taxes be today if there was no tax abatement? And at least then they can get a better sense of it. And they can plan for it for the longer run, but at least, I think it's important to provide that transparency. There's a lot of brokers that won't, or they're like, they'll like, let the attorneys deal with it. So I don't believe in that. I feel like, a lot of these abatements are starting to come toward their natural conclusion. So at the same time, I feel like it's important for a buyer to know. So we still have a few more points to cover that we haven't, and I've already covered a lot of different ways for you to kind of save some money. Awkwardly laid out apartments. So these tend to price at a discount. So like what happens if the only bathroom is located in the bedroom and it requires guests to walk through the bedroom? Pretty common, and you'll see this among the cheaper apartments. Very, very common in the cheaper apartments. So not everyone likes to enter the apartment through the kitchen. That's certainly an awkward thing. Or railroad apartments where you basically have a central corridor that connect each of the rooms. So it's like running through the train. I have seen railroad apartments that are actually really well laid out and really very, very advantageous. So, it just depends. But, that is certainly an option. But these are just a few examples of the odd layouts that we might be able to come across, and some may be desirable, but many of these awkward layouts sit on the market for a while. So if you're looking for a home and you need to get more space for the money, that's certainly one way. And let's say if you're looking for, let's go on to the next point over here. Let's say you want outdoor space, but you want to pay less for it, and we know that outdoor space is at a premium. But if you require it or really, say, this is something I really, really want over here, consider outdoor space that's not optimally located. So what if the outdoor space is only accessible in one bedroom, or the only real access is via a narrow and steep spiral staircase? Now, these outdoor spaces are going to be priced less than, something that's laid out right off the living room. So these are things that are, all under consideration. And I want to bring one final point to our, this episode over here, how to get more space for your money. And that final point might be sweat equity or problem buildings. And, perhaps you're buying into a building with no problems, and you might have special assessments needed to help fix the building issues. Or you might need to just volunteer a lot of your time to help on the board, providing leadership and guidance in exchange for a lower price due to all the problems in the building. And you'll see some of these buildings also have, a more difficult time trying to find financing. So I've laid out many, many different ways in which you could potentially save quite a bit of money and get more space for your buck. So again, I hope you enjoy these offerings and these considerations when we talk about Harlem Stories. Thank you for joining us today.